I want to tell the story of the part of our family that came from Sicily as well as I can, for much of it has already been lost, and before it is all gone, I want to put it down for you. Without them coming here, none of this life that we have would be here. A totally different history would have been written. When Catherine and I visited Sicily in 2019, and one of the questions I wanted to answer was why? Why, over 100 years ago, did they feel they had to leave their home as so many other Italians did at that time? But before we get into that, a little history of Sicily. About 2,800 years ago, the first of many peoples colonized and conquered Sicily. By looking at the map of the Mediterranean Sea, you can see why Sicily was such an important piece of real estate. It was in the middle of all the action, in the middle of the trading in that part of the world. And it had a great climate and fertile soil to grow crops such as wheat, grapes, and citrus. Starting with the Phoenicians and then moving to the Greeks and the Romans, followed by various barbarians, and then North African Muslims, and then the Normans and the Spanish. Finally, the island was merged with Naples in the early 1800s, and this was followed by what was called the Risorgimento, which was the unification of Italy in the 1860s. Sicily then became part of the Italy that we know today. The unification of Italy caused a big problem for Sicily. The unification came through a civil war. The Kingdom of Naples fought with Piedmont in the north for control of the peninsula. The north won, and as a result, most of the power and resources of Italy went to the north. Still today, you can see the results of this. The north is as prosperous as Germany, and the south is not industrial at all. After unification, the south was left to fend for itself. As a result, from about 1876 to 1915, about half of the population of Sicily emigrated to other countries in order to seek a better life, to the U.S. and South America primarily. There was no possibility of making a life on the land in Sicily for so many people. Our family was part of that migration. In 1899, my great-grandfather and his eldest son, who was my grandfather, left their beautiful village by the sea, Termini in Maresa, on the north coast of Sicily. The father was 44 and the son was 10. If I was to write the film script of this departure, they would have first gone to the top of the hill to take one last look at the village on the bay, and then walk down the Via Roma as they left town. They would stop halfway down and look back one last time. These are the two paintings that I made of Termini after our visit, of those two spots. When they left, they first went to Palermo, and then they took a boat to Naples. In Naples, they got on a ship and traveled all the way to New York. In New York, they got on a train and without stopping, made their way to Portland, Oregon, clear across the country. Clearly, there had to have been someone from the village who had made the trip before, who told them to come and that they can make a life. The plan was that the two men would get established and send for Josephine, the younger brother Sam, and the daughter Josephine Rose. It took 8 years until 1907 before these three were able to join the first two in Portland. At that time, Josephine, the mother, was 49, Sam was 15, and the younger sister, Rose, was 10 years old. Obviously, Portland was much smaller then than it is now. The Italians created a community in southeast Portland between Division and Powell, which was the edge of town. It became known as Garlic Gulch. The story is that most of the Italian immigrants went into either produce or garbage. My grandfather's first job at 12 years old was to work in the truck farms just south of Powell. This was good bottom land, and this is now where the train yard is. Produce, fruits and vegetables, became his life's work. Over time, he grew to have a fruit and vegetable stall at Southwest 3rd and Yamhill. This was the market street of downtown Portland, and he had that business for decades. The family name was Campagna, and most of the family members were named Salvatore or Giuseppe, which is Joseph or Josephine, or Mary. The two brothers were Sam and Joe. The great-grandfather was a Salvatore, and his wife was a Josephine. Joe, the younger, married Sigismunda. Their kids' names were Sam, Joe, and Mamie, which became Mel. And you can see how confusing it can get pretty quickly. With this story, I can only go back as far as Salvatore Campagna, the father who brought his eldest son to Portland. This is the only picture I have of him. It is on his grave in Rose City Cemetery. You can see that the mother, Josephine, is buried here too, but I have no pictures of her. Next, I want to show you Joe, who is my grandfather. Here he is as a young man, having had his picture taken a few times. And here is Sigismunda, the girl he is about to marry, and her sister. They were Galuzzo girls. They were from the Garlic Gulch also, and their families were originally from Termini. Her sister was Mary, Aunt Mary of our ravioli recipe book. She married Sam, my grandfather's brother. Two brothers married two sisters. Here's the last picture that I have of Sigismunda. There are two kids. One is Sam, and the other is my mother, Jo. Within a year, tragedy would strike. The story is that the doctor delivered Mel, the third child, with forceps that had not been properly cleaned, and Sigismunda developed an infection internally after childbirth, from which she died. This left the young man with 3 small children. It wasn't possible at that time that he stay home and take care of the children, so he kept his work, and the 4 of them moved in with his brother Sam and Sigismunda's sister, Mary. Their house was located on the site which is now New Seasons Market at 21st and Southeast Division. The house was not large, but all the kids loved Mary, who had 3 kids of her own, Mario, who was my godfather, Joe, who was a lifelong friend of both Mel and my mother's, and then their brother Sam. Now in the house, there were 3 Sams, 3 Joes, Mary, Mario, and Mel. Sounds like the cast of a slapstick sitcom, doesn't it? Well, from what I was told, it was a happy time for the kids. But it could not go on forever this way. 9 people in a 2-bedroom house. After an appropriate mourning period and a certain amount of time, my grandfather decided to find a new wife. Coincidentally, his business partner in the market also needed a wife. My grandfather and he took a trip back to Sicily, back to Termini, to find a couple nice Sicilian women to marry. In my collection of family photographs, this photo is the most unusual. It's the only one on this kind of paper. It's the only one that's this size. And it's the only one that has my grandfather in it and no one else that I can identify. And I believe this is the only photo that was taken or that we have of when my grandfather went back to find a wife in Termini. He clearly is here surrounded by all the women and children. Perhaps he's related to most of them and seeing a lot of these people for the first time because he had been gone for at least 30 years before this photo was taken. This part of the story may not be true, but the story I was told is that the 2 of them were walking down the street of Termini, and out from a store came 2 women who started walking up the street ahead of them. My grandfather said, "You take the fat one, I'll take the skinny one." They met the women. They turned out to be sisters, Dina and Antonina. They married the two of them and brought them to Portland, and they lived the rest of their lives a block from each other. And the two of them, neither of them, learned how to speak English. They could understand pretty well, but they never really spoke very much. Antonina was the woman I knew as my grandmother. Antonina became the stepmother to the three kids. The brick house I knew as our family home was built that same year. And she had a good life with my grandfather. She and Joe did not have any children of their own. Now started a period of stability. Work at the market, kids and grown-ups living in the brick house, kids growing up. The culture in the house and the wider community they lived in was more Italian than American. The Sicilian dialect was spoken at home to a large degree and with all their friends. They kept a very Italian lifestyle, both at home and in their church life. St. Philip Neri on Division was the primary church of the Italian community. Church on Sunday, and all marriages and funerals were performed there, in addition to baptism and First Communion and all that stuff. The kids started growing up. Mel apparently always liked animals, and she had a series of dogs for the rest of her life. My mother was a strong-willed girl who turned into a strong woman and was always clear about what she wanted and knew how to get it. This was true her whole life, and apparently she came and went at will. She would have been described as the wild one. Now we are up to the 1940s. The war is going on, and all the men had their picture taken with everyone they could in their uniforms. My mother was getting into her late teens and wanting some independence, which included taking up skiing on Mount Hood. After the war, the Portland Rose Festival resumed, and the ships again started coming to visit the city. Girls were always told to stay away from the sailors, but not all of them listened. My mother met Jerry, they fell in love, and in order for them to be together, he transferred from the Navy to the Air Force. Here's my mother as she gets on the bus in Portland to travel to meet Jerry at the Air Force Base outside of St. Louis. Her parents were not happy and basically threw her out of the family. He was neither Italian nor Catholic. This was not acceptable. Here's the happy couple. They got married. And within a year, I was born. And this is my first Easter Sunday a couple months later. Here I am at a year and a half. This is the last photo I have of my father and I together. I have no actual memories of him. Here's a picture of my pregnant mother and a little boy. When I was a child, my mother told me that she was pregnant with me, and I asked who the little boy was. "Oh, a neighbor boy," was her answer. After my mom died, I went to my Aunt Mel with this photo and told her that this never made sense to me. Mel said she was sworn to secrecy at the time and never told anyone. The boy was me, and my mother was pregnant with twins who died at childbirth. These Italians and their damn secrets. By keeping this to herself, my mother cut herself off from all the healing she could have received. She was a strong woman, and one of her most common expressions was, "We don't have a problem here," which means I can handle it. Here's a photo of Mel when she traveled to be with my mother at that time. My mother was always a handful as a young person, and I think the stresses from this tragedy was too much for their marriage to handle. So after 4 years, my parents divorced, and I never saw my father again. From the pictures afterwards, it looks like we had a great time anyway. We stayed on for about a year in Illinois, and we lived for a time with a nice couple, and here's the lady who looked after me while my mother worked. But after a year, my mother was accepted back into the family, and we moved to Portland, and I got a family home and a big family who loved me dearly. I don't have very many photos that were taken inside the house, but that was the most important place, and it's centered around the dinner table. The house has a full basement that was lived in as much or more than the main floor. The house was kept formal. We rarely used the living room and dining room upstairs. The upstairs kitchen was used only when a second oven was needed or when pies and cookies were being made, so essentially at holiday time. I spent most of my time downstairs when not sleeping. When I was young, the cooking stove was a wood-burning stove. Wood was not a problem. Everyone, like my grandfather, who sold fruits and vegetables, had incredible amounts of wooden crates to have to deal with. In fact, you could tell when one of these merchants lived in your neighborhood because they all owned second lots where they stored the boxes. These wood boxes were not recycled. Recycling had not yet been invented. There was a wood room in the basement, and the boxes would be broken down and shoved through the window of the wood room, and then burnt in the stove to cook dinner. I think that stove was lit in the morning and burned all day long until after dinner. One of my jobs was to go into the wood room and get wood for the stove. That was the scariest part of my life. The room was pitch black, and the cord for the light hung down in the middle of the room. One had to move the 3 steps from the doorway and pull the cord before all the boogeymen would be dissolved in light. Then, at a certain point, the stove was switched out to electric. Perhaps when my grandfather retired, no more wood to burn was coming his way. No matter what day of the year, we always ate Italian style. The first course was pasta, and then a second course of protein and vegetables. Everyone gathering around the table to share a meal. Only on a couple of days a year did we eat upstairs in the dining room, Easter and Christmas. But my grandparents would entertain their friends up there when they had social gatherings. But the family always ate together downstairs. The biggest meal of the year was a dinner on New Year's Day when all the extended family was invited over. The group was so large, the dinner was held downstairs so that multiple tables could be put together. On holidays, ravioli might have been made in advance, and 2 roasts were always served. Speaking of pasta, in the storeroom, there was an incredible amount of dried pasta stored, mostly spaghetti and linguine. Let me guess, they had about 100 pounds on hand at all times. There was always a ball of provolone and a length of salami in the fridge. I could help myself, but there was one rule. I always had to eat it with bread. I'm sure this was to make sure I get filled up on the bread rather than on the salami and cheese. And I also think that this is where I had my first experience with how great cars were. You know, everyone who knows me knows that I like to have good cars, but this is where it all started. My Uncle Sam, rather than going to church every Sunday, he would pull the cars out one at a time into the driveway and wash them every Sunday, and then dry them with a chamois cloth, with a leather chamois cloth, and then look them over very closely. And any little nicks, he would take out the touch-up paint and he would touch up those little scratches. He loved his car, and my grandfather liked his very much also. And so what did we do socially together? Usually every Sunday afternoon, my grandfather, grandmother, and myself, we would get in the machina and we would take a drive, sometimes, or frequently, out into the countryside just for entertainment. Since my mother was a single mom in her 20s, when I was under the age of 10, I spent every weekend at my grandparents' so she could have a chance to be a young woman on her own. Besides giving me a great relationship with my grandparents, this gave me an opportunity to see what I think of as the old world. By this time, my grandparents had spent most of their lives in America, but still lived and thought like Sicilians from the old country. Perhaps this is where I get some of my attitudes of right and wrong. I would be reunited with my mother on Sunday. The whole family would meet for an early dinner, and I loved these weekly events for a lot of reasons. An important one was getting to be with my cousin Jim, who has always been like a brother to me. Through this family, I learned many of the good qualities of the old world, but also experienced some of the bad sides, mostly around their expectations and rigidity. I already said that my mother was tossed out of the family when she left to be with Jerry. It happened to her brother Sam also. He worked with my grandfather in the produce market, but when he moved in with a woman who was neither Italian nor Catholic, he was also thrown out of the family, and his banishment was permanent. My mother was a great employee, an office worker who could type a mile a minute with no mistakes, so we were always very secure. And as she made more money, we would move to a better apartment. In the late 50s, she started dating Bill Cronin, who became my stepfather. He was a Catholic, but not an Italian. But since he had such an engaging personality, the fact that he was not Italian was let pass. And besides, no way would they banish my mother again. They were too attached to me. Perhaps they softened up a little as they grew older. Bill and Joe were a modern couple. They dressed well, ate out, drank wine, drove a convertible, knew about French cheese, and had lots of friends who liked to party. In 1961, they were married, and Bill moved in with us. Bill and I always respected each other, but we were never close. He had a good education, and he had graduated from college, and this was a boon for me since he made sure I got a good education. And they took me with them, going out to dinner and on trips, and showed me how to navigate the adult world. I grew up, graduated from Jesuit high school, then went to the University of Oregon to study art. To my parents' credit, they didn't try to dissuade me from studying art, even though they had no idea how I was going to make a living, and neither did I. My grandfather died in 1968, and Antonina in 1969, while I was in college. Shortly thereafter, the state planned to put a freeway through southeast Portland, and they brought up a huge tract of land, including the brick house. The freeway was stopped, but we never got the house back. I moved to San Francisco in 1971 to study at the San Francisco Art Institute, and a couple years later met Carol. We went traveling to Europe for many months, and when we got back to the Bay Area, we got married. Then moved to Portland, and Jonah was born. My parents had always been heavy drinkers and smokers. Bill even more so. That began to take a toll on his health, and his career stalled. He had risen to become the insurance manager for Tektronix in Beaverton, and my mother was ready to move on from her career at General Motors. So they made a big move to San Diego when Jonah was about 2. They started a Venus de Milo weight reduction salon. And with my mother's gift with people, the business thrived. And she demanded that her customers lose weight. And you always did what my mother wanted. But after a few years, my mother missed her family, and especially being close to Jonah as he grew up. They sold the business and moved back to Portland. They were doing well. Bill was retired, and Joe went to work for Smith's Home Furnishings in the office. They went to Reno for fun and to the coast. Then one day, just before going on a trip, Bill suddenly died from anaphylactic shock. He was in his mid-50s. My mother continued to work for a few years and then herself retired. And after my mother retired from Smith's Home Furnishings, she very quickly went to work for me. She was our very first bookkeeper at Gamblin Artist Colors. And the story that I love the most about her is that whenever she was going to do collections, she would send me out of the room. We shared an office, and whenever she had to go get money from somebody who was not paying us, she would send me out of the office and she would let them know that not paying us was a sign of disrespect. They always paid. After a few years, she got sick and died. Cancer that she had been treated for 5 years earlier had returned. She died too young, at 65. And even though Jonah was only in high school, he was showing the good qualities that he would have when he became a man. We wanted my mother to see that before she was gone. So I went out and bought him his first sports coat, and then we went out to dinner. On the way out, we took him over to see my mom so she could have a peek at the man Jonah was going to become. The next time he wore the sport coat was at her funeral. The story of the family goes on, but I am stopping at this point since everyone else you both know and is around. So you can ask them any question you want about their history, which is your history. I encourage you to do so. Merry Christmas in 2021.